Hello and welcome to this review of my Apple M0110 and its accompanying Numpad, the M0120. Almost 4 years ago I reviewed this one, the M0110A, their combined successor, somewhat literally, so I guess you could also consider this a redux video of that one too. I'll be mentioning it at some places during the review anyway. The M0110 was the keyboard that came with the original Macintosh, and it was designed by Steve Jobs himself, which I guess would make it a sought-after collectible for die-hard Jobs fans. It was released in 1984, and somewhat uncommonly for the time, features a relatively small form factor, a variation of what we now call a 60% keyboard, except a bit weirder. I have an American ANSI layout one, as well as a German ISO model, which was a donation, so thanks again, mate. Compared to many boards at the time, the layout was much closer to that of a modern keyboard, but mainly because they just left a whole bunch of buttons off. Keyboards of the time mainly used the IBM XT layout, which was an 83 key layout with a numpad that also doubled as the arrow key cluster. The XT layout now looks extremely dated, and really it is, let's be honest, but the M0110's layout was picked up by Eiichi Wada as the basis for the well-known Happy Hacking keyboard, or HHKB, which in turn is the basis for many other modern 60% keyboards. So versions, albeit updated ones, of the M0110 layout can still be found on some keyboards. Let's put it like this: if the IBM Model M is the father of modern 101 key full-size layouts, then the Apple M0110 is the father of modern 60% keyboard layouts. Interestingly, the M0110's layout was deliberately designed to be obnoxious. For example, the arrow keys were left off because Steve Jobs wanted to bully people into using the mouse, which is this one, the M0100, which was also a donation. This one-button box was one of Apple's first mice, as it happens, and completes the original Mac HID trinity. This mouse was another victim of having buttons left off, by the way. Xerox's original mouse, where Jobs got the idea from, originally had 3 buttons, like most mice do nowadays, I guess. But Jobs only put 1 button on to make it uglier and less useful. I've had to use modern versions of these one-button Mac mice before as well, and it seriously sucks ass. Anyway, in addition to leaving off the arrow keys, the numpad was also left off so that they could sell you the M0120 keypad separately for $100, or about $250 adjusted for inflation. $250 for a numpad, let that one sink in for a second. The M0120 does include the option to use the number keys for navigation commands, as you can see off of the sublegends here. However, it's not clear to me whether these were actually generally usable as such. Things I've read suggest that these keys work only in specific Apple programs and not as general navigation commands. Hopefully someone with first-hand experience of using this on an original Macintosh can clear this up. In any case, the arrow keys are laid out in a really weird way, kind of an inverted L shape rather than the much more intuitive cross shape that was found on standard keyboards of the time. Apple was in fact extremely bad at putting their arrow keys in a normal shape. They produced many keyboards with fucked up arrow clusters over the years. It wasn't until the Apple extended keyboard that they put on a normal inverted T cluster, and even then you had to pay extra, as the standard Apple keyboard had a line nav, which was even worse, although ISO models used a slightly less terrible L nav. The ability to navigate at all using the numpad was even taken away completely very soon afterwards, note the lack of sublegends, and this practice is continued to this day. Mac keyboards still don't include the option to toggle the numpad between outputting numbers and nav commands, whereas most modern Windows keyboards still can using the numlock key. However, instead of a numlock key, Mac keyboards come with a clear key, which removes a selected piece of text or picture or whatever, exactly like would happen if you press delete or the other delete, which are somehow called the same on Apple keyboards, even though they're not. Utterly redundant as this is, in all fairness, the clear key isn't the only obsolete key. Ever since the introduction of a separate nav cluster in the Model M in 1985, which would become and still is the default keyboard layout, the numlock key is just about as useless. Another thing Jobs improved, massive air quotes, is the cable. It uses a ribbon cable with a 4P4C connector, which is exactly what they would use on phones at the time, but in order to make sure you couldn't just buy a 50-cent phone cable, they switched the pin out on the cable, so you had to buy their own premium cables. Yeah, exactly, that's not a recent thing for them. They've been pulling that proprietary cable shit since the early 80s. Afterwards, Steve Jobs got his arse fired, and the release of the Macintosh Plus during his absence saw the release of the M0110A, which immediately put back the arrow cluster and the numpad. The arrow keys are still in a fucked up shape, this time a different L, and it still uses the weird cable, but someone was nice enough to make me a converter ages ago, and so I can use it over USB. Unfortunately, both the M0110 and M0120 are in rather bad condition. Both have many switches that don't register, and they don't feel all that smooth. The German model, which is much cleaner, does work mostly and feels better too, but for some reason all the keys are shifted over one unit. So this is actually an I, that's a K, and that's an M, and this one is a space bar. So I guess for some bizarre reason the scan codes generated differed between the ANSI and ISO models or something. Either way, it's not really usable like this, obviously. The M0110A is, perhaps because of its considerably extended functionality, a lot easier to find than the original M0110, although even that one is not hard to get hold of at all. The rarest of the three is actually the numpad, I guess because it became somewhat obsolete when the M0110A was introduced, or because it was so expensive at the time. Despite the M0110's diminutive footprint, only about the size of a modern 75% keyboard, it's easy to spot that it's really tall. I mean, compare it to my fist. It's around 6.3 centimeters, or in imperial units, whoa, intense, yo, which is 3.5 times as tall as one of the aluminium keyboards. Some people will find the height uncomfortable, and indeed, if I rest my palms on the table, it quickly gets painful. However, with either a wrist rest or using a floating hand typing technique, it's not that big a deal. It weighs almost exactly a kilogram, the M0120 315 grams, and the M0110A a bit over 1.2 kilos, and they all feature the same type of build, which is impressively tough. The outer case is thick and hardy and comes with big bezels, and the sensing assembly features a metal mounting plate and is held together quite well. It can definitely take a few knocks. In fact, despite their age and abundance, I'm not sure I've ever seen one of these with significant damage to them. Nice! They all feature the same switches as well, Alps switches. Alps and Apple had a lot of history together, even going so far as Alps buying Apple's keyboard factory in Cork County, Ireland, which is incidentally also where this German model was made, like most of the other ISO keyboards. Alps would continue making their keyboards for years until Apple quit using mechanicals, after which they switched to disgusting plastic crap and then aluminium crap. However, the switches in these keyboards are not the SKCL or SKCM you're probably used to, but the earlier SKCC switches with tall cream sliders. Although they don't really look like SKCL switches at all, they do have a few things in common. They're their direct predecessors even. The slider is much bigger, as they were used during a time in which there wasn't really a height restriction on keyboards yet, and the mount is different, but the switch plate is exactly the same between the two. SKCC generally used the older black variant, while SKCL usually used the grey or white ones though. SKCC switches used a housing with a narrower bottom part too, so there was no space for an LED or tactile leaf, like there was with SKCL and SKCM, so SKCC are always linear. The only kind of exception is the caps lock switch, which is a latching variant that stays down with every other key press, a so-called alternate action switch. Noteworthy about this design is that it uses an external rather than an internal coil spring, presumably because the latching mechanism takes up its space inside the housing, and this external spring is threaded through the slider, which is a unique and very elegant solution. Otherwise, loose springs can get lost if you take off the keycap, and it also allows the switches to be ordered with the coil spring attached, rather than having them as a separate part. Additionally, the slider on these is shorter than those of the other switches. The rest are all SKCC Tall Cream, or the taller slider. As I mentioned, this was from before there were height restrictions on keyboards. When those were introduced in the early 80s, everybody made new low-profile versions of their switches, which most mechanical switches we know, including Alps SKCL and Cherry MX, stem from. SKCCs are smooth switches if you can find them clean, although they're nowhere near as dirt sensitive as Alps SKCL and SKCM are, but they're too stiff for my liking and the travel feels short somehow, even though it's not, it's 3.5mm. The feel is really quite buttery though, and it feels satisfying to press somehow, so I didn't mind taking it for a spin again. The A model at least, which does work properly. Perhaps the SKCC switch's most notorious trait is its tendency to produce extreme ping, which is a ringing sound that's produced when a key is pressed. The IBM Ping Master, which is this keyboard, got its nickname because of the massive ping produced by the SKCC green switches it uses. However, the true ping overlord is this series of keyboards in my opinion. The extremely roomy case, way roomier than that of the Ping Master, acts as a resonating chamber, amplifying the ping to almost biblical proportions. Incredibly, even though they're so similar, the German and American versions of the keyboard sound very different. Let me show you. I mean, how crazy is that? What's going on here? The ping can be mitigated by filling up the case with foam or something, but I'm not one to take a charming, characteristic feature away from a cool old keyboard like this. Still, if you don't like it, there are multiple guides online on how best to deal with it. The keycaps are thick and tall PBT with die-sub legends. They're very nice, even if the lettering is on the small side, and the contrast is rather low, which is a typical drawback of die-sub lettering, so they're somewhat difficult to read. At least the legends are in the correct corner of the keycap, which is more than can be said for most Apple keyboards. The bigger keycaps in particular are so turbo thick that they look more like little boulders than keycaps. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ, chomping Chupa Chups, look at that! They're 2.4 millimeters thick, which makes them among the thickest PBT caps I've ever seen. In 2018, there was a group buy of a project called the Modern M0110 by Jan Glad and Heroy Jenkins. This featured a case made out of two giant blocks of aluminium, support for 60% PCBs, and the option of an Alps compatible PCB too. I once tried out a prototype at a meetup. The thing was heavy as fuck. Really impressive work. Overall, it's a really cool little board with excellent build quality and pretty nice, if rather funky, switches, although I prefer SKCC Green or SKCL myself. If you can pick one of these up, it's a nice addition to any collection, provided they work and don't feel shit, of course. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.